All right, it's 1 minute past, so I think we'll kick it off. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining this Unmind community space, facing your fears and breaking the anxiety cycle. I would like to open this session by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands from which we're all gathering today. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to any First Nations people joining us today. If you haven't met me before or seen me before, my name is Jordana. I'm the Client Success Lead for Unmind in the region. Delighted to be working with many of our clients, including organizations that you are part of, to bring Unmind and its solutions, such as an event such as these, to you. Some of you might be familiar with Unmind already. I hope that you are. If you aren't, it's likely that if you found yourself in this session, it's because your organization does partner with Unmind. Unmind has a wealth of scientifically evidenced content and tools in the platform to educate you and help you and support you with all sorts of topics across the wellbeing spectrum. So if you haven't signed up already, please head to your organization name.unmind.com and sign up there. Or alternatively, you can download our app from the Google Play or App stores. You put in your organization name and a few details, and then you'll be able to use confidentially all of the tools and techniques we have in the platform. We'll also have some instructions at the end on how you can sign up on the spot if you haven't done so already. So I'm absolutely delighted to have with me today Dr. Leanne Harper. Leanne is a UK-trained chartered clinical psychologist with over 10 years experience working with people with mental health difficulties, from teenagers through to older adults. Leanne has worked both in the early intervention space, but also providing in-the-moment psychological support to those in crisis. And she's also been really heavily involved in training others as well, including emergency workers, such as nurses, police officers, prison officers, to help them understand mental health difficulties, both in themselves, but also in the people that they work with as well. She's really passionate about sharing mental health awareness, and through that supporting others to take their knowledge outside of the hospital and into real life situations. And very excitingly for our Australian audience, she is also a couple of weeks out from completing her overseas transition and being able to practice here as well. I promise that for the bulk of the session, I'm going to let Dr. Leanne talk, but to open the session first and a few housekeeping items. Today, we are here to talk about anxiety. It's a term that I'm absolutely certain we all hear on a day-to-day basis, and it's, as an adjective, become part of our casual vernacular to the point where many of us have actually become quite desensitized to it. But if you have ever experienced anxiety in a clinical sense, or you know someone who has, whether that's as a result of an anxiety disorder or simply suffering on an ad hoc basis based on what's happening in your life, you'll understand and be all too aware of how incredibly debilitating or insidious or simply what a negative life experience it can be. So we're really lucky to have Dr. Leanne with us today to explain the science behind why we experience anxiety, what avoidance does, and also, most importantly, to provide some really practical tools and techniques on how we can overcome and break the anxiety cycle in those moments and in the long term. The very last thing before we get started, we love an interactive session here at Unmind, so please feel free to use the chat function to share your thoughts and comments. If you feel comfortable, please share how you're feeling and what your experience of anxiety may have been in the past. However, for any questions that you'd like to put to Dr. Leanne, we're hoping to have about 15 minutes to get to Q&A at the end. So please put them in the Q&A function rather than the chat function so they don't get lost, and we'll get to as many of those as possible. So without further ado, Dr. Leanne, please take it away.
Thank you so much for that, Jordana. And hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's so nice to see so many people coming in to talk about anxiety and how it affects us all. So thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. And as Jordana says, we love this to be as interactive as possible. So if anybody has any comments, any experiences that they're willing to share or comfortable sharing in the chat, it would be great to hear from you guys as well. So the main aim of today is to spend some time talking about what anxiety is, talking about anxiety as a human emotion that we all experience, how it affects us, why it can lead to avoiding things, and then go into some information about what happens when we avoid things, what happens when we do things, and then going to spend at least half of the session talking about some practical steps for overcoming anxiety, working with anxiety. Yeah, oh my gosh, hi everyone. It's so nice to see people come in from so many different places. Hey, it's great to see you all. So yeah, this is going to be hopefully focus. Well, I'm going to explain the science behind anxiety, what anxiety is, and then really go into some practical steps. So first of all, what is anxiety? Anxiety is an emotion that tells us to act. Anxiety feels horrible because it's telling us to do something. It's one of the core human emotions that we have, and one of the most instinctive human emotions that we have, and that's because it tells us to do something. For example, if we saw a lion, anxiety would normally tell us to run. That's what anxiety was created for, and basically it's made to keep us alive. How it affects the body is that this is our bodies here. If we were in a situation where we saw a lion or a crocodile or something out there, don't forget that evolutionary speaking, if we saw something that could significantly hurt or kill us, our bodies respond to that, often quite before that our brain responds. Our bodies respond quite automatically. Our heart starts racing very, very fast. And what this does is it gets our lungs working. So our heart starts beating very fast, and our lungs start to get as much air in our bodies as possible, making our bodies as prepared as they can to either fight or flee. Even if our bodies we're in a situation where we have to freeze and not move, our body is still getting all of the blood around our system so we can run as soon as safely we can, so that we can keep ourselves safe. So our heart beats really fast, our lungs start working very, very quickly. We breathe in as much oxygen as possible, and that generally goes to our hands and to our legs. So sometimes we feel our hands, we start to shake, we get very sweaty, we sort of, all of our blood goes to our hands, and we notice that our legs start to shake. Sometimes our legs get a little wobbly, our legs, sometimes we say like they feel like jelly. That's all of the blood going to our hands and our legs so that we can run, and so we can either fight or grab things or just get out of the way as quickly as possible. Our blood goes to the parts of our body that's most likely to keep us alive. We also feel it in our shoulders. So do you know, has anybody ever had when somebody jumps or somebody walks in the room and not expecting, and you jump up straight away, your shoulders go up and your whole body sort of goes like this? Yes, thank you. Yes, so sort of you jump up straight away. What this is our bodies reacting sort of automatically. So we jump up like this, and it's our shoulders sort of going, we make ourselves quite big. And it's from a very evolutionary point of view, is that we're preparing ourselves, we look stronger. You know, like when you say, if you see an animal, you have to assert your dominance. It's kind of what we automatically do. So our shoulders feel quite tight because we're going up, and we automatically, without anything else, we jump up, we get ourselves in this big position to look a little bit threatening, even if we don't feel it. And we feel the tenseness in our shoulders. That's because our shoulders are coming back, we're looking, we're trying to be big, we're trying to physically be big and strong. Even in that's the situation when that's our partner jumping in when we're not expecting them to or something like that, we still have this automatic reaction, and normally we feel our shoulders go back. And that's why we can feel quite tense in our shoulders when we start to get anxious or in anxiety situations, because sometimes without realizing, we get this tension in our shoulders when we get anxious. That's our bodies preparing us to either fight or to be strong, or to, evolutionary speaking, keep us alive. So we feel it in our shoulders, we feel it in our hands, we feel it in our legs. All of our blood is going to those parts of our bodies that are going to keep us alive. Anyone ever mentioned the butterflies? Feel like butterflies in your belly? Or some people say it's like a ton of bricks in your belly. That's a really English thing to say. I know you guys don't work in tons, but this feeling in your belly, like a heaviness or like a churning or like something in your belly when you get anxious. What that is because all of our blood is going round to the outside of our body, all of our blood's going to our extremities. The blood isn't going to the parts of our body that aren't vital in that moment, keep us alive. Yeah, it's a horrible feeling, that gut feeling in your belly. Sometimes when you feel that feeling, it's like something's off, something's not right. Sometimes our belly will tell us something's not right. And that's because all of the blood is going to all of our extremities, and it's not going to the parts of our body that aren't vital in that moment. So things like our bladder, our digestive system, the things in our body that aren't a priority right there, aren't getting the same amount of blood. So sometimes we feel in our belly that something's not quite right because our organs aren't quite working the same. They're not quite working the way they normally do because all of our blood is shooting off to parts of our body. It's getting us ready to try and keep us safe, basically. Do you feel it in your throat as well? Sometimes you get like a dryness in your throat, or you feel like a lump in your throat here. That's the same sort of feeling. It's actually the blood's not going to the throat the same way. The blood's like the saliva and things like that aren't quite being formed as normal because our body is just going, the blood circulation is going to the part of the body that keeps us alive. So that's why we can feel all off sorts when we start to feel scared, when we start to feel anxious, we feel sweaty, we feel quite nauseous sometimes. All the blood is preparing us to either fight or flight. Our blood is going to the parts of our body that are going to keep us alive in that moment, and then not going to the parts of the body where, like, we don't feel our digestive system working. We're not aware of it in the background, but we feel when it's not working quite the same way. And that's when sometimes we notice that we're anxious when we start to feel these feelings, because our body works quicker than our mind. Our body puts us straight there. Because all of the blood is going to the parts of our body that's needed the most to stay alive, it does the same with our brain. So this is a very basic drawing of our brain. This was drawn by my wonderful colleague and friend, Dr. Karina Mildrew. She is a trained medic. She is did her medical training and then swapped over to psychology. And I just love the way that she drew out the brain. So I will always use her wonderful drawings. So this is a very basic view of the brain. And the way that we describe the brain when we describe anxiety is a very, very basic terminology of the brain. We'd make it as simple as possible. So I'm not going to go into all the neuroscience of what's happening, but we just break it down to understand what happens when we get anxious. So this is our whole brain. And the way that we as psychologists look at the brain is in 3 separate sections. So we first look at the old reptilian brain. This is the core bit of the brain, and it's, I don't know if I can show you when I'm on the screen, but it's like this bit of the brain. It's just in the back here. And that's the part of the brain that we share with all other animals. So it's called the old reptilian brain. It's the oldest part of the brain, and across species, we all have this bit of the brain. So it's responsible for fleeing, fighting, feeding, and reproduction. So called reptilian because even like lizards, I can't think of any other reptiles. I want to say crocodile, but like all animals have this bit of the brain. This bit of the brain keeps us alive. The next part of the brain is what we call, there we go, the social part of the brain. So it's like the mammal bit of the brain. So this was evolutionary speaking, the next bit of the brain. And this is in part of like social dynamics. So our attachment, our caregiving, the way that we play, generally socially interacting with other people. This is part of the brain that can also be seen in other mammals. So I don't know if like if you've ever seen an adult elephant like playing with its baby, or other like social mammal creatures sort of playing and forming that attachment with other people. That's this bit of the brain that we share with them. And that's very much a part of being social, being in a group. It's that instant pull. If you hear a baby cry, you just feel something straight away because we have that social part of the brain. We're all social beings. Then the next bit of the brain is the human brain. This is what we as psychologists call the tricky brain. This is the bit that's evolved more over hundreds and thousands of years. And this is that higher level sort of cognitive strategic thinking. So this is like our metacognition, the way that we think about thinking. It's this bit of the brain that allows us to be here in this presentation and think about how our brain works, that sort of higher level thinking. This bit of the brain also allows for imagination. We can picture ourselves in different situations. We can problem solve. We can think about the future. This is the bit of the brain that allows us to go shopping on a Sunday and plan our meals for the week. That I don't think elephants quite do that. So it's that added bit of the brain, which is why we as human species evolved the way that we have, and we can do a lot of that extra thinking. The reason we call this the tricky brain is because it can also get us into a little bit of trouble. This is the bit of the brain where we can imagine situations. We can future plan. We can plan for difficult stuff. And a lot of research has shown, so if you put people in an MRI scanner and you get them to imagine running, the same neurons go off in your brain as if you were actually running. So with this extra tricky bit of the brain, we can imagine situations and our brains then fire off the neurons as if we are in those situations. So if we're actually doing the thing. The reason this can get a little bit tricky is because we can imagine situations where we're problem solving. We're imagining for a big presentation at work. We want it to go really well, so we're planning. As part of that planning, we plan for things that could go wrong. We're using our imagery, we're imagining things going wrong, and the next thing, our brain thinks we're in that situation, our brain thinks it's happening. It sends off the emergency alarms, and we start to feel anxious about it. The problem is when we feel anxious, our brain goes into the anxiety, we feel it in our tummy, our blood only goes to the part of our body that keeps us alive. The part of our brain that keeps us alive is this brain. It's the back bit. So the blood's not going to this complex, tricky brain anymore. So what happens is the brain thinks about a situation, thinks about what could go wrong. Our body thinks it's happening. Our body responds to it like it's going wrong. And the blood's no longer at this bit of the brain to tell it that we're safe. We're no longer able to realize that we're okay. We're not thinking, we're not in that complex situation. We're not being even able to problem solve using this bit of the brain, because the only bit of the brain that's getting the blood is the bit that keeps us alive. That's why we call it the tricky brain, because it can imagine situations that we're not in, and then our body responds like we're already in them. It can also imagine the worst case scenario, because that's what our brain does. Our brain will try and keep us safe. It's a little bit like an overly helpful friend. It will say, but what if, but what if, but what if? And then it will sort of plan for the worst case scenario, trying to keep us safe. However, unfortunately, then we feel like we're already in it. We feel like it's happening. Ooh. What we then do is we want to avoid it. So basically our brains plan for situations. We think of situations, it feels quite scary, we don't want to do it. Anxiety feels, a few people said in the comments before, anxiety feels awful. Anxiety is a emotion, like fear particularly, is an emotion that tells us to act. Evolutionary speaking, fear feels awful because we want to get out of a situation, we want to be safe. Fear is there to tell us we need to do something to keep ourselves safe. The issue is, we are now in a situation where it's quite rare, it can still happen, but it's quite rare that we're in a life or death situation. So sometimes we can feel anxious about something, we can feel the anxiety, all the horrible feelings, we don't want to do it. So I feel like that was a whistle-stop tour in what happens to our bodies when we get anxious, and how the blood stops going to the thinking bit of the brain when we can get anxious. Or well, our blood is only going to the parts of our brain that keeps us alive when we're in scary situations. That's what anxiety was evolved for. We are now in a situation where things that are quite scary weren't around hundreds and thousands of years ago. So the things that can feel quite anxiety provoking, maybe related to work, maybe related to social situations, are a little bit more heightened now than they were thousands of years ago. We're not in anxiety situations where we are having to run away from lions or crocodiles, or it's quite rare that we're in those situations. We are in situations that feel really scary, and we don't want to feel all of the physical sensation that comes with fear, because it's there, so we don't feel it. Therefore, we can sometimes avoid it. So if we do a bit of a poll now, I don't know if I can read the poll as it goes up. Here we go. So just a bit of a poll to ask, have you ever avoided or put off doing something because you felt anxious about doing it? And this doesn't mean put it off completely. This can like put it off for a couple of days, avoided it for the next hour. But if you ever put off doing something because the thought of doing it, the thought of feeling the anxiety around it, you're like, nah, I can wait, or find a reason to not do it. Yes, thank you. I can't see that poll now. Okay, wonderful. So yeah, 97% of people. That's, yeah, it's very, very normal. Anxiety is there so that we don't feel it. That makes no sense, but we feel emotion, we want to avoid it. It's completely normal that we then therefore avoid doing things that are associated with fear. However, that can then lead us getting into what is called an avoidance cycle. So what happens is we have an anxiety-provoking situation. So we are going out for a meal with people we really don't want to be with, or it could go one or two ways and we're not quite sure about it. Or we have to do a presentation at work. We have to go for an interview, and the thought of it, we think things like, they're going to think we're stupid, they're going to realise we get like imposter syndrome, they're going to realise we don't know what we're doing. Our brain goes to the worst case scenario, because that's our brain looking after us. It plans for the worst. So we have an anxiety-provoking situation and we get out. We think, I am never going back there again. We are in a difficult situation. It starts to turn sour. We leave. We're gone. We're like, no way. Or the thought of doing something scary at work, and we go, no, not for me. I'm out. We leave. We avoid it. The issue is, when we avoid the difficult situations, we also avoid the opportunity to learn that we can cope with the anxiety, and that the catastrophe that we fear doesn't happen. We avoid the opportunity to prove ourselves wrong. We avoid the opportunity to realize that we can do it, and that the feared situation isn't as bad as we think it's going to be. But we get short-term relief. And our brain says things like, thank God I left when I did. That was so scary. Who knows what would have happened? We get a hit of like dopamine of protection of, thank God I left when I did. Who knows what could have happened? And the catastrophe of what we think it's going to be continues to build in our head, because we've protected it. We feel like we've protected ourselves. We've got out. We've done okay. It's just, it kind of confirms to us that we couldn't have coped. We left and we think, thank God I left when I did. We've not had the opportunity to prove that we can do it. We get short-term relief. What we also get is what we call increased anticipatory anxiety. Because we've not shown ourselves that we can do it, or we've not shown that we can handle it for longer than we thought, or anything like that, it increases our anxiety around doing it again, because we think we couldn't have coped. We've confirmed that we couldn't have done it in our brains. So the thought of doing something like that feels more scary. The less we do something, sometimes the scarier it can feel. I don't know if you've ever felt like when you had something to do and then you didn't do it, and then it comes around to do it again, it feels even bigger. Sometimes it feels more scary. And that is when you get in the anxiety cycle. We get increased anticipatory anxiety. That can then lead to us then panicking in other situations. And sometimes they can feel like they're a little bit related. So for example, say you have a presentation at work and you're up all night, you can't sleep. Your brain is going off on all the things that could go wrong. You feel it, you feel sick, you feel anxious, you're tired, and you think, I can't do it, I'm calling in. Calling sick, I can't go. And you're, thank God I left that. You get a short-term relief, there's no way I could have done that. The issue with the increased anticipatory anxiety is that then I've got to go back in tomorrow. What am I going to say? People are going to ask if I'm okay. People are going to be worried about me. What do I say? How am I going to face my friends, my manager, people around me? The situation, sometimes then the original situation was the presentation at work, and now the anxiety situation is going into work completely. And sometimes that can be like, oh, I'm not going in tomorrow either. And then before you know it, this can sometimes escalate quite quickly, and you've not been in all week. Your friend from work gives you a call, checks in you're okay, and you're like, oh, I can't lie to her. I can't lie to them. They'll know. So then you avoid speaking to them, and then you avoid looking at the phone. And I'm using quite big examples here, but just as a way of showing how this anxiety loop can sometimes, it can start on one situation, and then the situations related to the anxiety can feel bigger and bigger. Sometimes it could be like one restaurant that you don't like going to because something scary happened, and then you associate with that, I don't eat in any fish and chip shops because it reminds me of that one, and it can get sort of bigger and bigger. I don't know why I said fish and chip restaurants, that was the worst restaurant to choose, but it's a situation basically where that one situation, the more we avoid that, things that are associated with that can then grow bigger and bigger. And then more situations become more anxiety provoking. Sometimes this can happen to an extent where it starts to impact our lives more and more. Sometimes it can be quite gradually. I know the example of sort of calling into work is quite a sudden one. That does happen. I've definitely seen that happen. But sometimes there's more gradual situations when the anxiety around different things can sort of sneak up on us. And then before you know it, we're not doing things that we were really enjoying. And it can have more of a significant impact on our lives, because the anxiety provoking situations can just gradually get bigger and bigger, sometimes without us realizing, and that can really affect what we're doing. So in terms of this avoidance cycle, we can see how doing the scary thing can feel horrible. We get this short-term relief, but then we get trapped in a cycle where we're not proving to ourselves that we can do it. And our brain is trying to keep us more and more safe. The more we avoid something, the safer our brain is trying to keep us. With this in mind, I now have one more poll, if that's okay. Okay, so the poll is, how long on average does it take for people to seek treatment for anxiety or low mood when symptoms start? So if we say symptoms in terms of the anxiety starts to get in the way of like day-to-day functioning. So that's anxiety that really has a significant impact on our days. Like we all feel anxious in some situations, but it's when those anxious situations start to increase more and more, and they start to have an impact on our day-to-day lives. So if you're not sure, no worries, just take a guess of how long it possibly takes. This was a study from 2017. I'd love to see an updated version. But yeah, just take a guess at how long anxiety, I think it was the study on this study was 78% was anxiety, 22 was low mood. But bear in mind, if people can get caught in a bit of an avoidance cycle with it. Oh, mixed answers. Yeah, lots of mixed responses there. I was really shocked when I read this research. The right answer was actually 8 years. It can take 8 years for people to seek support for anxiety symptoms. Yeah, that really shocked me as well. And I work in mental health. I think that really goes to show how much this anxiety avoidance cycle can really get in the way, to the extent where it can actually get in the way of us seeking support for it as well. I will send a link to the research. I'll pop a link in the chat after this. Like I say, it's 2017, so possibly a little bit out of date, but was still quite significant. So yeah, that really shows the impact of this avoidance cycle, and how much the anxiety provoking situation can get bigger and bigger. Another way of explaining anxiety is through the graph. So we have anxiety, time. Anxiety comes up quite quickly, suddenly, often before we even realise. So rapidly increased anxiety motivates us to escape, because that's what anxiety is for. Anxiety is there to keep us alive fundamentally. So it goes up. Common expectation is that anxiety will continue to increase catastrophically. That's often how it feels when we get anxious. We feel like there's no way we can cope, and we can get to feeling like something's going to go catastrophically wrong quite quickly. This can also be related if people experience panic attacks. Often the first thing we think when we experience a panic attack is that we're going to die. That's the first thing that we think of, and it feels scary, and then we can't breathe, and it really does feel like we're going to die. When I used to work in A&E, that was a lot of the time I was working with people, and it really, anxiety really convinces you that you can't cope with it, because anxiety is trying to keep you alive. So anxiety will go for the biggest threat and work on that first. Anxiety will go for the biggest threat, and it would rather think the worst case scenario because it wants to keep us alive. So a common expectation, the anxiety will increase catastrophically and we won't be able to cope. That's what anxiety tells us. It wants us to get out of the situation. What actually happens is that we hit this peak of anxiety, which isn't nice. We hit this peak and then it starts to slowly reduce. So exposure to the fear can result in what we call habituation. The anxiety doesn't increase as catastrophically as our brains tell us, and it slows to reduce. And I'm even doing this now. I'm not quite as sweaty as I was when I started. I think I hit peak of anxiety and then it started to slow down. The more we do something, the more we then start to habituate to the anxiety. So the more we do that scary thing, the less anxious we get doing it, and the quicker we start to feel sort of more less anxious. That's not saying that things don't still feel anxiety provoking. That's not saying that some situations can still feel quite nervy. I think there's a time when it starts as fear, becomes anxiety, and then goes into nerves. I would say, like, Taylor Swift always gets anxious before she performs. She's been doing it for years. But when she performs now, it's probably not the level of anxious as when she started. I still get anxious before I teach, before I present on something, but my anxiety is not as high as it was the first time I did it, but still enough to know that it's something that I care about. So we'll still get a little bit anxious, and things aren't always going to go plain sailing. Things could go wrong, but it's rare that they go as catastrophically wrong as our bodies are planning for. And then the more we do something, the more we get what's called habituated to that thing, the less scary it is, and the quicker we come back down to our equilibrium, the quicker our bodies start getting the blood all around the body rather than just to the external bits. So it's all right saying the more we do the scary thing, the less scary it gets. Yes, facing our fears. The more we face our fears, the less scary they become, the more we habituate to them. But how do we do it? It's all well and good saying just do it, but actually the practical techniques of how to do it are also really important. So how to do the scary thing, how to face our fears. The first thing that I will always talk about is what's called a fear ladder. All psychologists, therapists, psychotherapists, we love a fear ladder. If you go and speak to anybody about a general fear, about anxiety, about social anxiety, anything like that, you will probably be met with a fear ladder. We love them because they work. We love them because they are super, super effective. And there's probably times in your life when you've done it without realizing that you're doing it. So at the top, you have the very scary thing. What can be the very scary thing can always be broken down into many, many different layers until at the bottom you have the scary but doable thing. So one example of this is when I worked in a community team. I'd often work with people with social anxiety, and people I'd work with where the very scary thing was leaving the house. The anxiety had got too much and people weren't able to leave the house. So what I'd do, I'd sit down, I'd go around and meet with them, and we'd break that down into barriers, into little ladders, steps on the ladder, where that's a scary thing, very scary thing. Can't speak. The scary but doable thing is like, okay, I can sit outside my back door for 5 minutes. I can open my back door, I can sit outside there for 5 minutes. So that's what we did. We sat just outside the back door and we habituated. So I went round, we sat behind the back door, we were there for a minute. I went the next week, we were there for 5 minutes. I went the next thing, we were there for 10 minutes. It's that habituating, it's that proving to yourself that you can do it, and the catastrophic fear will not happen in that situation. And it's only when you are habituated at that first step of the ladder, you move on to the next step. So it's only when they can then sit outside with a partner, with a child, with someone else around them, that I'd go around and be like, okay, let's sit in the garden. Let's sit and have a cup of tea. It's very English, isn't it? Let's sit and have a cup of tea in the back garden. And then you do that enough times that feels habituated, and then you stand at the front door, or even stand next to the front door, and then you open it, and then you take one step outside. And I'd often work with people very, very gradually on each step of the ladder until before you know it, you can walk around the block and walking around. Is that a cultural walking around outside? You can walk around, and that feels like the scary but doable thing. So each step, you're just taking one step up the ladder. And we can often do these in very different ways. So for example, doing this presentation, maybe the scary thing is doing a presentation to lots of people on a webinar, but a less scary thing is doing it to your colleagues, doing it to 5 people in the room that know you, that you can practice in. Get habituated to sharing with them before you then start to do that at conference level or something like that. With everything that can feel quite scary, we can always break that down into little steps. Say it's an interview, the very scary thing is going for the interview, but can you practice answering questions yourself? Have you got somebody around where you can talk through the interview, talk through the job with, get used to having that conversation and talking about yourself, because that can be scary, but talking about yourself in a safe environment. There's most of the time ways to break down the very scary thing in the fear ladder and prove to yourself at each step that the catastrophic thing doesn't happen. The next stage is breathing. Again, I would very rarely talk about anxiety without talking about your breathing. But what I will do is talk about why. So this is our anxious body. When we breathe normally, like just every day, when we're breathing, not thinking about our breathing, we breathe in oxygen, we breathe out CO2. Our blood levels are quite balanced. We breathe in and breathe out, we often don't have to think about it. When we are exercising, we breathe in more oxygen because we're using our muscles, we're using more energy, we breathe out more CO2. That's why people often say when you're exercising, and my PT always says, just breathe. It's because you're breathing in, you have to breathe in more because we're using up more energy, we're breathing out more CO2. The thing is, when we're anxious, is we're breathing more in. We're breathing in as much as possible, sometimes in quite shallow breaths. We're getting as much oxygen to our blood, to our muscles as possible. The thing is, in most of our situations when we're anxious, we're not then using up the muscles. So our body's getting ready to fight, but we're not fighting. We're not physically fighting. We're not physically winning. So we're breathing in a lot of oxygen, and we're not breathing out as much CO2 because we're not using as much energy. This can then lead to the blood levels being unbalanced, which can sometimes lead to why we get quite lightheaded when we get anxious. Sometimes we get a little bit dizzy because the blood levels aren't balanced. What breathing exercises do, and what really focusing on the breath can do, is help to get those blood levels balanced. It's the slow breathing can help to slow down the heart, which then helps to slow down the organs, which then helps to tell our body that we're safe, we're okay, and all the blood can get back to all of the rest of the body and also to the front bit of the brain. Has anybody ever said to you when you're anxious, like, oh, just think rationally or think straight or problem solve? Like we cannot problem solve when we're anxious because the blood isn't going to the bit of the brain that we need to problem solve. So before we can do anything, we have to breathe. We have to get that blood back into our body. We have to get the blood circling around all of our body so that all of our body is working. It's optimal. That's why breathing techniques are effective. And the most effective breathing technique is the one that we remember. So if any of you guys have been to a yoga class, or been to meditation, anything like that, you may have your own breathing techniques that work for you. There's so many different kinds. I use square breathing because it's the easiest to remember, and the most effective is the one that we remember. So I often recommend square breathing. I do square breathing myself because there's always a square or rectangle in a room that we're in that we can go around. So square breathing is inhaling, holding, and exhaling. Holding. I've done this 1,000 times, go do it with my hands. And then you go in, hold, and exhale. And then hold. And what that does, like even myself, I found myself talking slower. It slows your body down. It helps get that heart beating slower so that the lungs are going in a more sustainable way. And if you notice when you start breathing, your shoulders, so when we're anxious, our shoulders are up, we're quite tense, and as soon as we start breathing, really intentionally, slowly breathing, our shoulders start to relax. It's a way of telling our body that we're safe, we're okay, and it can help get all of that blood back to the part of our brain that can then problem solve. The best advice I can give to anyone in this situation is breathe in. As I said, I used to work in A&E. I used to work with people who were in like mental health crises, who were really struggling, and I spent most of my days sitting with people breathing, because the best thing we can do is just get that oxygen back around our body. Square breathe in, 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out, 4 seconds hold. So it's 4 on 4 edges. It's 4 and 4. For me, I think this is the simplest one to remember. And when we are in anxiety situations, we need something that's as easy as possible for us to do. Yeah, so this is why breathing techniques, I'd like to explain why breathing techniques is not like you don't say to somebody, just breathe. That's not very helpful, but actually sit in. Sometimes if you're with somebody else and you can feel they're getting anxious as well, telling somebody to just breathe or something like that isn't always helpful. But if you slow down your breathing, sometimes we copy the people around us. So if you intentionally take these longer and shorter, meaningful breaths, sometimes we notice the people around us will also do that. As long as we do it in a supportive way. Sometimes just that real deep breathing can help. It can get all that blood going back around our bodies. Breathing, going with the fear ladder, so doing something that's scary but doable, breathing whilst we do it can help then stop us feeling so much anxiety symptoms again. That can help us to habituate a little bit quicker, and we can move on to the next scary but doable thing. Finally, I'm going to talk about grounding techniques. So grounding techniques is something that we call is what is helpful for us to come back into the moment, come back into the here and now. It can help us get out of our own heads, especially when we can be worrying about something and we can go to the feared place quite quickly with it. When our brain is really going very, very fast in terms of all the things that could go wrong, we can use grounding techniques to help us come back into the moment. And what that is each of our senses. So 5 things that you can see. You can do this if you're in a room with other people, just look around the room, notice things you can see. If you're on your own, sometimes it's helpful to say out loud 5 things that you can see in the room, and really be as specific as possible into lots of different detail. So maybe saying I can see an orange chair. I can see a plant in the corner. This is terrible because you can't see what I can see. You can just see a grey wall behind me. But if you look around your room now and just notice 5 things that you can see. And then 4 things that you can touch. And again, try and get some different things. So sometimes your trousers, right for your trousers. Sometimes when I'm doing something that I know is going to be quite anxiety provoking, I've got some really nice soft trousers that just feel amazing. So I wear them because then I know that I can feel them. And then go for something else. So maybe for your trousers, then feel like the desk, feel like the hard surface. Just really feel things that we don't normally pay much attention to. Sometimes what can help with this is if we have like a cup of water with us. This one's quite good because it's got like the edges, but if you're sat in a meeting, you're with somebody, just holding your cup doesn't draw too much attention to you, but you can really feel what it feels on the outside, feel the temperature, especially water is quite good because it's quite cold. Changing your temperature can be really helpful as well. 3 things that you can hear. Sometimes when we listen, we can hear a lot more. Now that I've stopped, I can hear the aircon unit that I couldn't hear before. Bit of traffic. And again, really focusing on what we can hear can be nice to sort of come back into the moment. 2 things you can smell. Smell is wonderful in terms of bringing us back to the here and now. Smell is fab for memories. If you're doing something where you are, if you're presenting or you're going to an interview or something like that, maybe having some sort of perfume or something on yourself that you can just give a smell if it's got a good memory attached to it. Bonus. Sometimes like smelling your coffee. Coffee's not great for anxiety, so I don't like using that one. If you drink too much caffeine, it's going to increase your anxiety. If you're just smelling it in terms of calming, like, you know yourself, you know how much coffee is too much coffee and how much is okay. But just like, yeah, really trying to smell something that can help bring you into the moment. And one thing you can taste. Again, if you're going into a situation, maybe having like a really strong mint beforehand, or just something that can help with that. Yeah, so the 5 senses for grounding techniques, again, can help bring you back into the moment, especially when your brain's going overdrive, as they do, and help bring you back into the moment. Do some deep breaths and think about what we're doing right now, and just focusing on the here and now can be helpful. So in terms of practical techniques, I'm aware that I'm going into Q&A time now. So how to do the scary thing is plan a fear ladder if you can, gradually go up the fear ladder. Breathing techniques, get that blood back into the brain, get that blood going around the rest of your bodies. And some grounding techniques, remind ourselves that we're safe. Obviously only do that in situations where you are safe. Anxiety is there for a reason. In your situations where you're not safe, obviously use all of the anxieties to get out and be safe first. But if you are in a situation where you're safe, then using grounding techniques help to remind yourself that you're in the here and now and that you can do it. So in summary, anxiety is an important human emotion. It tells us to act. When we're anxious, our blood is only going to the parts of our body that keeps us alive. Therefore, the best thing we can do when we start to get anxious is to breathe. The more we avoid things, the scarier they can become. Equally, the more we do things, the less scary they can feel. If you want to do something scary, break it down. And most importantly, breathe. You can do it. Thank you so much for the chat. I'm aware I've left that a little bit, but hopefully Dana is around for questions and answers. And there's just some extra support there on the back as well in terms of like Lifeline, 24 hours, somebody's always on the other end of the phone. If you do feel like you're anxious and it's too much and you need somebody else to cope with, there's always other people around to support you through these techniques as well. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Leanne. That was fantastic, and really appreciate all of the practical elements of it. I remember really clearly when my therapist first explained the biology behind things like fight and flight, and it was such a game changer in being able to understand what was happening in my body and being able to move forward. So yeah, I think the scientific element of what you presented today was absolutely fascinating. So thank you. As you can see, everyone, there's some information up on the screen. Definitely take note of Leanne's details so that you can reach out afterwards if you would like. You can also see some helplines as well. And I just want to also point out the QR code on the top right-hand corner, which will allow you to sign up to the Unmind app or to access it if you have it already. We do have some amazing tools on anxiety, as well as many other things. There's over 700 pieces of content in the platform. We have courses on anxiety, but we also have some amazing tools that align perfectly with what Leanne was talking about in terms of grounding techniques and breathing exercises and things like that as well. So please definitely go in and check it out. For the moment, we have 10 minutes or so to go through some questions that have come in. We've had a few come in. If you do have any questions for Dr. Leanne, please send them through. We'll try and get through as many as we can. First off, we had one come through the chat, and I'll just reel this one off before I lose it. Leanne, is this the 8 years of undiagnosed and untreated anxiety the reason why depression usually goes hand in hand with anxiety?
Oh, that's a brilliant question. Yeah, I mean, it very much could be. I know that's such a psychology answer going, maybe. But yeah, the reason they are so linked is because especially anxiety can stop us from doing things that we previously enjoyed. It can also make us feel very lonely. Anxiety will often tell us that we're the only people that feel like that way, that nobody else could possibly feel as anxious as us, because again, our brain jumps to the worst case scenario because it's trying to keep us safe. So when we do get anxious about things, we're less likely to do things that we enjoy, and then when we're not doing things that we enjoy, we're not socializing with people, that's more likely to affect our mood, which is why they can often go hand in hand. Again, with sort of low mood, if we're then less likely to do things that we previously enjoyed, or less likely to engage in stuff, then doing something we haven't done for a long time can feel more scary. And that's when it can get stuck in that cycle. Well, it's not really a cycle, it's more of a trap. It can really get stuck there. So yeah, I think that's why they definitely do go hand in hand. Have I answered that question?
I think so. I think that makes a lot of sense now that you've laid it out in that way, about how one thing can lead to another. I've just got another question here from the Q&A. I'm supporting someone with anxiety, but we don't know what the specific fear is. Just negative thoughts and withdrawal across most things. Where do we start?
Yeah, that's the thing with that's the thing. Sometimes it can be really hard to pinpoint what it is, especially if it's sometimes it's our thoughts. Sometimes it's different sort of thoughts that can come in and then lead us to worrying about often what other people think, or if we're going to do something wrong or something like that. Sometimes if you're supporting someone, you can feel like you're not quite sure where to go. That's when more specialist personalized support can be helpful. Sometimes sitting down with a psychologist, if you have a mental health plan or something like that, can help to really pinpoint and deep dive into what that could be, and do some more exploring around it if it's not sort of obvious thing, but it might be that you sit down with another psychologist and talk it through, then you're able to find something within that. So yeah, sometimes these techniques are helpful. So again, the breathing technique, and anytime you start to feel the anxiety, it can be helpful to keep a diary and just sort of be aware of times when you feel more anxious compared to others. And then sometimes you can sit down and look across the links. But sometimes when it's our thoughts that make us anxious, there's not clear links because we have no control when our thoughts come in. So again, that's when it might be more helpful to sit down with a psychologist or with somebody like a therapist or something like that to explore it in a little bit more detail. So yeah, sometimes it can be helpful to just breathing techniques, or sometimes if you feel like you finding what it is more helpful than sitting down with a professional for that more personalized support.
Perfect, thank you. And just in addition to that, I would say on the supporting others piece, we have some content on that in the Unmind platform as well. And you can also extend your account to invite a friend so they can access the content too. So if you feel like that may be helpful, please consider it as well. Leanne, I've had two questions come in and they're actually very similar in nature. So I'm going to choose one. Any tips to break the procrastination generated from anxiety? The tips you shared are great when we were in the midst of the anxious moment, but when we are in the avoidance stage, how do we break that procrastination?
Oh, that's a fab question. I think the best advice I have for this is sometimes procrastination can come with a fear of we have to get it right and we have to like do this certain thing. So sometimes the best way to sort of break that down is to just do 10 minutes. Again, it's a bit like the fear ladder, but do it with the thing like that you're procrastinating. So say you are writing a report, then your only task for that day is to write the title on a piece of paper. And I mean, don't do anything more than that. Just do that one thing. And then the next day you spend 10 minutes planning something around it. And again, no more than 10 minutes. I was reading a book recently and they said like, stop at 10, even if you want to carry on, just stop, make yourself want to do it more the next day, because then you've left sort of whilst you're winning. And again, in terms of that habituation, telling yourself you can do it rather than trying to do it all and then feeling overwhelmed and then feeling flat out and like you can't do it again because it took so much from you. Just do 10 minutes and again go back to the ladder and just do a little bit. And however, like the smallest step you can think of, halve it. Do less than what you think, and just do a tiny amount each day. So 10 minutes a day can be really effective, or just really breaking it down so that sometimes procrastination can feel like because it's a big job or it's a big thing to do. So make it as small as possible, and then you start to feel like you're on a roll.
Thank you. That's super helpful. I think 10 minutes a day feels achievable at this point in time anyway, and definitely something we can all carry through with us. There's a question here on genetics. Is anxiety a genetic thing? How come some people are more, inclined to be anxious than others?
Oh my gosh, this could be a whole other webinar in itself. I don't know how to answer this in just a few minutes. There is so much to it. There is so much research. I think where we've got to is sort of a biopsychosocial approach. which basically means it's a bit of everything. Sometimes our genetic disposition is that we feel things. Sometimes the anxiety alarm that goes off in us does go off quicker. That can be related to genetics. It can also be related to life experience and the environment that we're in, especially if we're around people who feel more anxious, and we're possibly more likely to as well. But yeah, it can be genetic, it can be social, it can be so many things. I think, yeah, sometimes we can get caught up in thinking what it is or why, wherein actually, regardless of what it is or things like that, there are so many things that can help, and focusing on the things that can help as well. Not even just what I was talking about today. There's so many different things that can help with feeling anxiety and things like that. So it's a full webinar in itself, talking about social environment, but my really terrible answer is both. I think it's a bit of everything. We're all very, very complex human beings. So genetics and environment and experiences are all involved together.
Not a terrible answer at all. We'll just have to plan another webinar so you can go into it in more detail.
Yeah.
Final few questions. What is the difference between a feeling and emotion?
Oh.
I know we're going deep today.
Yeah, these are great questions. I think they're pretty much the same thing. I think we feel our emotions. So I think it's really hard to pick them apart. I think we call them different things in terms of, like, it depends on like the way we speak and our culture, our environment, in terms of how we describe them. If we say things like, I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling anxious, then we're feeling an emotion. So I think that's a really hard question to ask without more context, but I think they're very similar. We feel our emotions, but it's very rare that we have an emotion and don't feel it in our bodies. We also, with the idea our brain and our body is separate, is I don't know where that came from. It makes no sense. Our brain and our brain controls our body. So a lot of the emotions that we feel, we physically feel. So when we're anxious, we feel it in our belly. When we're sad, we feel it in our chest sometimes. When we get excited, we feel all of our emotions in our body. So yeah, I think, without going into too much detail of being able to have a chat with the person that asked the question, I think quite similar or the same.
No, thank you for touching on that. I think it's food for thought, definitely. I've got a question here that I can really relate to myself, so I'm going to read it out. This usually happens with me, that if I'm in a list where something is being inquired, I tend to feel very anxious when my name is next to the list or my name is called. It has happened. It has also happened that I've not been able to articulate myself in such situations. What can I do to avoid this or minimize this?
Sorry, can I just repeat that? So it's a situation where if your name's mentioned in an environment,
your name is going to be called and you know it's going to be called, feeling anxious in the lead up to that, or when it's being called, and then not being able to articulate yourself in the situations because you feel so anxious.
Yes, definitely. Oh yeah, I definitely feel that as well. Any sort of, even if you only have to say yes, you can know it's coming. It's that build up, isn't it? So yeah, completely normal. Yeah, I'd say the best thing with that is the breathing. So especially when you know it's coming in, you can feel it. Focus on your breathing, maybe practice in your head what you're going to say before you say it. And I think it's just that acceptance of the thing. If your words don't come out, like 99% of the time, people will be okay with that. It's okay to stumble on your words or not get it perfect straight away. So I think pressure to, if you stumble, it's okay as well. Yeah. Which again is a lot easier said than done.
It's easier said than done, but I think that was groundbreaking for me as well, because I had to start realizing that other people don't care. Like, hopefully nobody minded that at the beginning of this webinar I tripped up on a couple of words that was, probably meant more to me than it did to anybody else. And I think that's something that we need to keep reminding ourselves of. I'm really sorry, we're going to have to wrap there because we have reached time. But Leanne, thank you so much for being here and taking us through all of that. And everyone, thank you for attending. I hope you found it useful. We really appreciate if you would submit our feedback survey, which should be in the chat, but it will also appear once we close the session, and it will really help us to shape future events. But yes, I hope that you've all learned something today and will be able to take some of these tools forward to help you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Leanne. Have a good rest of your day,
thank you for
everybody.
everyone in the chat as well, and for the Q&As. And yes, it was great to spend the afternoon with you all. So thank you.